Hey guys, welcome back tonight. Let's get comfortable, dim the lights, and just settle in. Maybe you've had a long day. Maybe your brain is still buzzing with things you have to do tomorrow. Let's just gently push all of that to the side for a little while. We're going to float back in time, not to a world of grand battles or dramatic showdowns, but to a much quieter and frankly much weirder place. We're going to talk about what life was really like for medieval princesses now. I know what you're thinking. Castles, handsome princes, beautiful gowns, maybe a friendly woodland creature or two. And sure, there were castles and gowns. But the reality was a lot less fairy tale and a lot more political pawn with a side of questionable hygiene. It was a life of being constantly watched, constantly judged, and constantly reminded that your entire worth was tied to who you could marry and how many sons you could produce. So, get cozy, pull up the blankets, let's drift back to a time when being a princess was less about storybook endings and more about strategic alliances and hoping your husband wasn't your first cousin. Again, our story begins. It's not with a grand announcement, but with a quiet, anxious waiting. A king and queen are expecting a child. The entire court, the entire kingdom holds its breath. They're praying for a boy, of course, an heir, a strong little prince to continue the dynasty. And then the baby arrives. We're faming, and it's a girl. You can almost hear the collective polite sigh rippling through the castle corridors. A girl, well, that's useful. In a different way, she isn't the heir, but she's an asset. A little bargaining chip with a royal title. From the moment she takes her first breath, our princess is already on the chessboard. Her name is chosen not for its beauty, but for its political resonance, perhaps after a powerful grandmother, or a saint favored by a potential ally, while her hypothetical brother would be groomed to rule. Her education is a finely curated list of skills designed to make her a valuable bride. She'll learn to be quiet. She'll learn to be graceful. She'll learn to manage a large household, because one day she'll be shipped off to a foreign land to run someone else's castle. This wasn't about personal enrichment. It was about making her an effective ambassador and a competent manager for her future husband's property, which of course would one day include her. She would learn to read and write, often in Latin, the universal language of the European elite, as well as the language of her future home. This was crucial. You couldn't have a princess showing up in France, for example, unable to understand a single word of the marriage contract she was signing away her life with. Can you imagine the diplomatic incident? She'd be nodding along, thinking she's agreeing to the dinner menu, when in reality, she's just handed over 3 provinces in a strategically important port. So, languages were a must. She would also learn music, embroidery, and dancing. These weren't hobbies, they were tools. Music and dancing were for courtly display, to show that she was refined and cultured. Embroidery was a way to demonstrate her patience and domesticity, creating intricate tapestries that basically screamed, "Look how well I can sit still and not cause any political problems." Every stitch was a testament to her quiet, unassuming nature. It was all part of the package. It's a perfect, docile, and highly useful royal bride. Her childhood, as you can imagine, is not exactly filled with carefree romps in the castle gardens. She was surrounded by adults from day one, ladies-in-waiting, tutors, governesses, all of them watching, correcting, molding. Her posture had to be perfect. Her speech had to be measured. A princess did not giggle. She smiled demurely. A princess did not run. She glided. It sounds exhausting, frankly. Imagine being a 5-year-old and having to glide everywhere. She would have seen her parents, the king and queen, but not in the warm, fuzzy way we might think. They were busy people. Ruling is a time-consuming business. Her relationship with them was often formal, a series of scheduled appearances. She was a piece of their dynastic strategy, and their interactions would have reflected that. Love was a luxury, duty was the currency of the realm. Let's talk about her living situation. Sure, she lived in a castle. But medieval castles were not the pristine, comfortable places we see in movies. They were cold, they were drafty, they were crowded. The idea of personal space was, to put it mildly, a foreign concept. Her chambers might be more luxurious than others, with tapestries on the walls to keep out some of the chill and a proper bed instead of a straw pallet. But she would rarely, if ever, be alone. Ladies-in-waiting were her constant companions, sleeping in the same room, attending to her every need, and, of course, reporting on her every move. Privacy was not part of the deal. And then there was the matter of health. We have this image of princesses as these delicate, beautiful flowers. In reality, childhood in the Middle Ages was a brutal numbers game, and being royal didn't give you a pass. Disease was rampant. Medical knowledge was creative. A fever might be treated with bloodletting or a potion made of crushed beetles and herbs. A simple infection could be a death sentence. For every princess who survived to adulthood, there were likely siblings who didn't. She would have grown up with death as a constant, familiar presence in the background. A grim reality that no amount of silk or jewels could change. One of the most defining features of her young life would be the staggering, almost suffocating boredom. Her days were structured, a monotonous cycle of lessons, prayers, and stilted social obligations. There was no hopping on a horse and riding off into the sunset for an adventure. Her world was the castle walls. Her view of society was the carefully curated selection of nobles and courtiers who moved within it. Existence was a waiting game. Waiting to be old enough. Waiting for the right political alliance to emerge. Waiting for her life to be signed over to a stranger. Consider Isabella of France, daughter of King Philip IV. She was betrothed when she was a small child and married to King Edward, II of England at the age of 12. At an age when a modern girl is navigating middle school, Isabella was shipped across the English Channel to a foreign court, married to a man she barely knew, and expected to become Queen of England. There was no adjustment period, no time to be a kid. One day she was a princess of France. The next she was a queen in a country whose customs and politics she had to learn on the fly. And her husband, Edward II, was famously more interested in his male favorites than in his new young wife. You can just imagine the warm welcome she received. It was a brutal introduction to the reality of her role. Her feelings were irrelevant. Her happiness was not a factor in the equation. She was a treaty, made flesh. And Isabella's story, while dramatic, wasn't an anomaly. It was the norm. A princess was a political tool from birth, and her marriage was the single most important event of her life. It wasn't a romantic affair. It was a transaction. Her value was measured in the lands, titles, and alliances she brought with her. She was the living seal on a contract between two powerful men. Let's just float for a moment on that thought. Every aspect of your life, from the language you speak to the way you hold a fork, all of it is training for a single event. A test. And that test is your marriage to a complete stranger. A man who might be decades older than you, a man who might be cruel or foolish or simply indifferent, a man whose language you might barely speak. Your performance in this test will determine not just your own fate, but the fate of your home country and your new one. No pressure, though. This process of finding a suitable husband didn't just start when she was a teenager. Oh no, the negotiations began almost as soon as she was born. Ambassadors would travel between courts, carrying portraits and lists of assets. And let's be honest about those portraits. They were the medieval version of a heavily filtered Instagram photo. The artist's job was not to capture a perfect likeness, but to create a flattering advertisement. A princess might be described as having a graceful neck, which could mean she was elegant, or it could mean her head was a bit small for her body. She might have sparkling eyes, which could mean she was lively and intelligent, or it could mean she had a fever. It was all about marketing. Take Margaret of Austria, for example, a classic case of being a pawn in the dynastic game. She was born into the ridiculously powerful Habsburg family, so her marriage prospects were top tier.
At the tender age of
3, she was betrothed to the Dauphin of France, the future King Charles VIII. 3 years old. She was sent to be raised in the French court to learn their language and customs, to essentially become French before she was even old enough to remember her home. She was, for all intents and purposes, the future Queen of France. But in the world of royal politics, nothing is certain. After 10 years of being raised for this one specific role, Charles VIII decided to double-cross the Habsburgs. He repudiated the marriage treaty and instead married Anne of Brittany, a much more strategically valuable bride at that moment, because of course he did. Why stick to a decade-long plan when there's a better deal on the table? So Margaret, now a teenager, was unceremoniously sent back home, humiliated and now considered, well, used goods, in a way. Her political value had taken a major hit. She eventually did marry, but her first formative experience was being trained for a job for 10 years, only to be fired before her first day. It's a rough start to a career. And for a princess, her marriage was her career. The emotional toll of this kind of upbringing is hard to fully grasp. To be constantly on display, to have every part of your being, from your appearance to your fertility, scrutinized and valued by men you've never met. To know that your own desires, your own dreams, are completely and utterly irrelevant. It's a strange and isolating existence. She was surrounded by people, but deeply alone. She was a symbol, a prize, a piece of political machinery. But the girl inside that machinery. No one was particularly interested in her. She would learn to build walls. She would learn to show a placid, agreeable face to the world, no matter what turmoil she felt inside. Her ladies-in-waiting might be her companions, but they were also spies for her family, and later, for her husband's family. Trust was a dangerous thing. She had to be a politician from the nursery. She learned to read the subtle shifts in mood. At court, to understand the intricate webs of power and influence, to know who was in favor and who was not, her survival depended on it. It was a silent, lonely education in power, observation, and self-preservation. Far cry from the fairy tales, indeed. And for our little princess, this was just the beginning. The real test was yet to come. So our princess has survived childhood, a feat in itself, frankly. She's been educated, groomed, and polished into the perfect royal bride. She's fluent in Latin, passable in 2 other languages, can embroider a reasonably inspiring religious scene, and hasn't caused any major political incidents. By medieval standards, she's a roaring success. And now the main event begins. The marriage market. This wasn't a gentle process of courtship. It was a brutal, often humiliating series of negotiations. Suitors, or more accurately, their ambassadors, would come and go. She would be presented, inspected, and discussed like a prize mare, her height, her health, the width of her hips, a crude but crucial indicator of childbearing potential, it was all on the table. We hear stories of ambassadors writing back to their kings with brutally frank assessments. Her teeth are a bit crooked, one might write. But her dowry includes 3 castles and a claim to the throne of Naples, so perhaps we can overlook it. It was that cold, that transactional, and the princess herself had absolutely no say in the matter. 0. Her father and his council of advisors would weigh the options. Is an alliance with Spain more valuable than a truce with the Holy Roman Empire? Does this Italian duke have enough money to be useful? Or is he just offering an empty title? Her future was being decided in a room she wasn't invited into, by men who saw her as a line item in a budget. Let's talk about the age issue. I've already touched on it with Isabella of France, married at 12. This was shockingly common. The age of consent, as a legal or social concept, just didn't exist in the way we think of it. The key milestone was puberty. Once a girl was deemed physically capable of bearing children, she was considered marriageable. This could mean girls as young as 12, 13, or 14 being married off to men who were 20, 30, even 40 years their senior. The psychological impact of this is just staggering. Imagine a 13-year-old girl being told she is to leave everything she has ever known, her home, her family, the few familiar faces in her life, and travel for weeks or months to a completely foreign land. A land where she doesn't speak the language perfectly, where the food is strange. The customs are different, and the weather is probably worse. Upon arrival, she's not greeted with a welcome party and a chance to settle in. She's immediately the center of attention, the new foreign wife of the king or prince. Every move she makes is scrutinized by a court full of strangers who are likely suspicious of her. They see her not as a scared young girl, but as a representative of a foreign power, potential spy, a rival for influence and power. It's her own ladies-in-waiting. The ones she brought from home for comfort are viewed with deep suspicion by the local nobles. Her every success is a foreign success. Her every failure is a personal one. And then comes the wedding. Grand affair, of course. Days of feasting and tournaments. But the main event, the part the entire contract hinges on, happens. After the party is over, the consummation. This wasn't a private romantic moment. It was a state-sanctioned, often semi-public, piece of political theater. After the wedding feast, the bride and groom would be escorted to the bedchamber by a procession of high-ranking nobles and clergy. The bed would be blessed by a bishop. There would be jokes, toasts, and a general air of invasive expectation. In some traditions, witnesses would stay in the room or just outside a curtain to verify that the marriage was, in fact, consummated. The future of the dynasty and the validity of the treaty depended on this one physical act. There was no room for romance or shyness or even basic human dignity. It was a clinical, contractual obligation. For a teenage girl who has just met her husband, it's hard to imagine a more terrifying and humiliating ordeal. The next morning, the blood-stained sheets might even be displayed as proof that the transaction was complete. The asset had been delivered and officially received. Once the wedding was over and the ink was dry on the treaty, our princess's real job began. And she really only had one job: produce a male heir. That's it. That was her primary. And for a long time, her only function. Everything else was secondary. The pressure was immediate and immense. Every month that passed without a pregnancy was another month of whispered speculation at court. Is she barren? Is she unhealthy? Did her father cheat us with a faulty product? When she did become pregnant, the entire kingdom held its breath. 9 months of prayers and anxiety. And then the birth itself. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was, to put it lightly, a life or death gamble. It was a private affair presided over exclusively by women midwives and ladies-in-waiting. But it was also a moment of supreme political importance. If the baby was a boy, church bells would ring, celebrations would be declared, and the princess's position at court would finally be secure. She had done her duty, but if the baby was a girl, well, another polite collective sigh from the kingdom. A daughter was fine. Another potential bargaining chip for the next generation. But it wasn't what they needed. The princess would be expected to get back to it, to try again for a boy, and again. Her entire worth, her safety, her influence, all of it rested on her ability to produce a son. Let's float over to one of the most tragic examples of a princess's life going sideways. Juana of Castile. You might know her as Juana the Mad. She was the daughter of the legendary Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the power couple who funded Columbus and united their kingdom. Juana was intelligent, well-educated, and by all accounts, deeply passionate. A dangerous trait for a woman in her position, she was married off at 16 to Philip the handsome Archduke of Austria. And he was, apparently, extremely handsome. But he was also arrogant, frivolous, and a serial philanderer. It was a classic case of a political match, with zero regard for personality compatibility. The problem was, Juana fell completely, desperately, obsessively in love with him. He was the center of her entire universe. Philip, on the other hand, saw her as his moody Spanish wife, who secured his claim to the throne of Castile. He was less invested. His constant cheating drove her into fits of jealous rage. There are stories of her attacking his supposed mistresses, cutting off their hair. She would refuse to eat, would scream and cry for days. The court was scandalized. Princess was supposed to look the other way. She was supposed to tolerate her husband's affairs with quiet dignity. That was part of the job description. But Juana's passionate nature made that impossible. Her love was as intense as her grief, and she couldn't hide it. her behavior was of course seen as madness, not as the understandable desperation of a heartbroken woman in a powerless position, but as a fundamental flaw in her character. Her husband, her father, and later her own son used this madness as an excuse to sideline her. 8. Suddenly, Juana's grief was epic. She famously refused to be separated from his coffin, traveling with his decaying body for months. Again, not exactly the picture of stable, queenly behavior. Was she truly mad? Or was she just a woman who had been systematically stripped of all agency, whose only outlet for her powerful emotions was this destructive, obsessive love?
Yes.
It's hard to say. But what is certain is that her male relatives found her madness incredibly convenient. They locked her away in a castle in Tordesillas, where she remained for the last 46 years of her life. She was the rightful queen of Castile, but she never ruled. She was a prisoner in her own kingdom, a queen in name only. All because her emotions were too big, too inconvenient for the men who wanted her power. Her story is a grim reminder of how precarious a princess's life could be. Even with a crown on her head, she was disposable. This brings us to another bleak reality of a princess's life: the utter lack of power. She was surrounded by the trappings of power, the jewels, the servants, the titles, but real tangible influence was almost always out of reach. She was the queen consort, not the queen regnant. Her power was indirect, exercised through her husband, or if she was lucky, her son. To get anything done, she had to be a master of manipulation and soft power. She would have to win her husband's affection, or at least his respect. She'd have to build alliances within the court, finding nobles who were loyal to her, not just to the king. She had to be smarter, quieter, and more cunning than everyone around her. A single misstep, a single poorly chosen word, could see her influence evaporate overnight. And let's not forget the ever-present threat of the king's mistress. In many courts, particularly in France, the official mistress was a recognized position.
Wow.
She might even have her own titles and apartments at court. The mistress was often the king's true companion, his confidant, while the queen was the official heir producer. Can you imagine the daily humiliation, having to be polite at court functions to the woman your husband actually loves? While you are relegated to the role of a ceremonial broodmare, it was a psychological tightrope walk, and many queens fell. To complain was to look weak and foolish. To accept it was to swallow a daily dose of poison. The only winning move was to pretend not to care. And that, in itself, must have been a crushing burden. So our princess is married. She's in a foreign land, and her primary job is to produce a male heir. She's navigating a court full of political rivals, smiling politely at her husband's mistress, and generally living in a state of luxurious, perpetual anxiety. What does she actually do all day? The answer, in a word, is wait. Her life was a meticulously structured routine of waiting. Waiting for her husband to visit her bedchamber. Waiting to get pregnant. Waiting to give birth. Waiting for the next formal meal. Waiting for the next religious festival. The daily life of a high-ranking noblewoman was, by our standards, mind-numbingly dull. Her day would begin early with prayers. Religion was the bedrock of medieval society, and for a princess, piety was a non-negotiable part of her public image. She would attend Mass every day, often for several hours. This was both a spiritual duty and a social one. It was a chance to be seen by the court, to project an image of serene devotion. A pious queen was seen as a blessing upon the kingdom. An impious one, well, that was just asking for trouble. After prayers and a small breakfast, her time would be filled with the management of her household. A royal household was a massive operation, like running a small corporation. There were hundreds of people, ladies-in-waiting, servants, cooks, grooms, guards. As the lady of the castle, she was theoretically in charge of all of it. This meant overseeing supplies, managing budgets, and settling disputes among the staff. It was a significant administrative role, and a princess who was good at it could earn a great deal of respect. It was one of the few areas where she could exercise direct authority, but much of her day would be spent in leisure. In medieval, noble leisure was not exactly thrilling. The number one activity was embroidery and needlework. She and her ladies-in-waiting would sit for hours upon hours, stitching elaborate tapestries and religious vestments. Again, this wasn't just a hobby. It was a way to display her virtue. It kept her hands busy, and more importantly, it kept her quiet and out of the way of the men who were busy with the important business of hunting and politics, of course. She would also read. A literate princess was a valuable asset. She would read religious texts, of course books of ours, lives of the saints. But she might also read poetry and chivalric romances, which is deeply ironic when you think about it. She's sitting. They're reading tales of brave knights rescuing fair maidens and falling in love, while living in a reality where her marriage was a business deal and her husband is probably off visiting his mistress. It's like reading a travel brochure for a country you're permanently banned from entering. A little window into a world of emotion and free will that was completely denied to her. Music was another important pastime. She would learn to play an instrument like the lute or the harp and to sing. This was for courtly entertainment. When the king was in a good mood, she might be called upon to perform for him and his guests. It was another facet of her role as a decorative, cultured object. It's meant to reflect well on her husband. What about getting outside? Well, that was a carefully controlled event. A princess couldn't just go for a walk. Might go riding, but always side saddle, which looks elegant, but is a ridiculously impractical way to sit on a horse. And she would always be accompanied by a large retinue. She might be allowed to practice archery or falconry, aristocratic sports that were deemed suitably refined for a lady, but again, these were structured, formal activities, not a chance to run free. The closest she got to nature was often a pleasance, a manicured private garden within the castle walls. It was a beautiful, controlled, and walled-in version of the outside world, perfect metaphor for her life, really. Let's consider the food. We imagine these great medieval banquets with whole roasted swans and mountains of food. And those did happen on special occasions. But daily meals were a more staid affair. And what you ate was a sign of your status. Nobility ate a lot. Of meat, venison bore all sorts of birds. Vegetables were generally considered peasant food, and everything was heavily spiced. Spices like pepper, cloves, and nutmeg were incredibly expensive, imported from the East. Using them in abundance was a way to show off your wealth. So the food was rich, heavy, and probably tasted overwhelmingly of cloves. It's not exactly a balanced diet, and this brings us back to health. Beyond the ever-present danger of childbirth, a princess's life was not a healthy one. The diet was poor in essential vitamins. Castles were cold and damp, leading to respiratory illnesses. Medical care was still a terrifying blend of superstition and guesswork. An ailment might be blamed on an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The cure, you guessed it, bleed the patient to remove the excess humor. Or maybe some leeches, or a nice purge to clear out the system. It's a miracle anyone survived. Personal hygiene was also different. Bathing was an occasional luxury, not a daily habit. Perfumes and powders were used to mask body odor, not eliminate it. And sanitation in a castle was a constant challenge. They had latrines called garderobes, which were basically stone chutes that emptied into the moat or a cesspit below. You can just imagine the smell on a hot summer day. It was a world of grime and germs that we can barely conceive of. No amount of royal blood made you immune. One of the strangest and most isolating aspects of her life was her relationship with her own children. We have this modern idea of a mother's bond, but for a medieval queen, it was much more complicated. As soon as the baby was born, especially if it was the precious male heir, it would be handed over to a wet nurse. It was considered unseemly, even dangerous for a highborn lady to breastfeed her own child. The belief was that the mother's character could be passed through her milk in any way. She needed to be ready to get pregnant again as soon as possible, so the royal children would be raised in their own separate household, their own staff of nurses, tutors, and servants. The princess would see her children at scheduled times. She was their mother, the queen, a figure of authority and reverence, but not the person who tucked them in at night or comforted them when they fell. That bond was often formed with the nurses. This created a strange emotional distance. It wasn't that they didn't love their children, but the relationship was filtered through layers of protocol and duty. She was the head of the dynasty, and her children were its future. It was a relationship of state, as much as one of family. Think of Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the entire Middle Ages. She was Queen of France, then Queen of England. She had 10 children by 2 kings. But for most of their childhoods, she was either on crusade, involved in political machinations, or imprisoned by her own husband. Henry II. Her relationships with her sons, most famously Richard the Lionheart and King John, were intensely political. She fought for them, she schemed for them, she ruled for them. But the cozy maternal image just doesn't fit. She was their commander as much as their mother. It was a different world, with a different set of rules for family. For our typical princess, her children were her greatest political asset. Her legacy, and, in a strange way, strangers she saw for an hour a day.